Hello, I'm John from the Christian Century, and I'm joined today by someone I'm just now somehow meeting for the first time face to face, even though he teaches at my alma mater, Pittsburgh Seminary. It is John Burgess. John, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, so John recently wrote for the magazine an article about his relationships with Russians. It appeared in our September issue. It was called Conversations in Wartime. It also appears on our website with the title Talking to My Russian Friends About Ukraine. So we are going to talk about that article and about John's communications with his Russian friends in this time. But first, John, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
So I've been teaching at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary for almost 25 years. And over the last 15 years, a lot of my research has focused on Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church. In fact, since 2004, I've had 3 year-long sabbaticals in different parts of Russia. So I've really gotten to know people on the ground, parishes, monasteries, and have been tracking very closely what has been happening since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, wow. Well, that's a good segue into the first thing I wanted to ask you about, which is this extensive experience you've had in Russia and studying Russian Orthodoxy. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more, maybe about some of the specific things you've been looking at within Orthodoxy and why? Why Russia? Why have you been so fascinated with this part of the world?
Right? Actually, when I started to get interested in Russia, I wanted to learn some Russian. And I had my first Russian lessons at age 48, summer intensive at the University of Pittsburgh, where everybody else in the class was 18 or 19 years old. So this has been a big investment in my life, in my scholarship. Your question about why. For a long time, I've been interested in what happened to Christianity under communism. My first encounter with that was actually in East Germany, where I was a student at a seminary in East Berlin, 1984 to 85, before the Berlin Wall came down. And that then grew to a greater interest about religion in other parts of the former East Bloc, former Soviet Union. And kind of on a whim, I decided I really wanted to get to know Russia. I had never been there. I didn't really know anything about Orthodoxy. So when my first sabbatical came up at the seminary, 2004 to 5, we were able to arrange a year in St. Petersburg. Things kind of took off from there. Once we got there, well, first of all, I discovered that one summer intensive at the University of Pittsburgh doesn't get you too far. So we spent that first year still learning a lot of Russian. But also, I just started going to monasteries and parishes and attending the liturgies and really trying to immerse myself in that world. And to my surprise, found that since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russian Orthodox Church had really blossomed. Everywhere I went, there were new parishes going up, new monasteries being founded, this remarkable rebirth of Orthodox life. And that made me curious, since in the West, we think of religion generally in decline, at least Christianity. But here was one part of the world where things seemed to be expanding, growing, coming back to life. So that got me really interested.
Yeah. Well, in this article, you describe several very specific friendships that you have maintained even during this difficult wartime, the war Russia is, perpetrating on Ukraine. And some of the people you have stayed in touch with seem to be really consuming a lot of Russian, what I think I would call propaganda, and sending it to you. And I was really fascinated by the ways that you have responded to those types of communications and the relationships that you've had with those folks. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the ways you've chosen to engage with people who are sort of true believers in what Putin is saying. How have you maintained those relationships? And it seems with with some level of patience and grace. How have you approached that?
Well, it's something I'm still working on and learning as I go. And of course, communication itself is not all that easy. It's mostly via email and texts and what's up, occasionally a phone call. But just to say a couple of things from the outset. First of all, my friends are all over the map, the full spectrum. I've had friends who have fled from Russia to the West. And as you say, I have others who are very strong pro-Putin supporters, and then everything in between. The second thing from the outset is just to say that the people are reluctant to say very much. The level of political repression is very high, and people are just cautious. And I think Russians in general don't like to dare to air their dirty laundry with foreigners. You know, they talk among themselves at the kitchen table, but they don't want to speak badly of their nation in front of a foreigner. So I have to read through the lines a lot of times. But you're right. I do have a number of friends who, from the beginning of the war, made it very clear that they thought Russia had the righteous cause. They were very supportive. One of their arguments was that there had been low-level war going on for 8 years in the Donbass area. That's true. That's something we didn't hear much about in the West between Ukraine and pro-Russian separatists in that eastern part of Ukraine. So the pro-Putin friends of mine said, you know, this is not Russia starting a war. This is Russia ending a war. And things like this, you know, that were really just hard for me to swallow and at first made me quite upset. We're getting these reports of cities being bombed to smithereens, of civilians fleeing, and that just didn't seem to register at all to these people. They were so sure that Russia was going to win quickly, and that it was fully justified in its actions. Frankly, for a time, I just quit responding. I was hurt. I really didn't quite know, because these are people who had invited me and my wife into their homes. They had fed us. They had provided for us. They'd taken us on trips. They'd been patient with our wooden Russian, you know, people who had just surrounded us with love. And then to see them filled with such hate towards the Ukrainians and calling them Nazis and fascists and justifying everything that their army was doing. But after I kind of got over that initial shock, I said to myself, you know, I think the best thing I can do is not argue, but just try to keep the relationship open. I think if I argue, they're just going to get angry. They're going to feel more self-justified. They're not going to want to have anything more to do with me. And I made the choice, you know, that in some situations where you're not going to be able to persuade the others and they're not going to be able to persuade you, as a Christian, it's not that I wanted in any way to indicate that I agreed with them. So it wasn't that, but I wanted them to know that I remembered the good times we'd had together. I remembered how generous and loving they had been to me, and that I prized that relationship. And I wanted them to know that I kept them close to my heart, that these are important people to me. So, you know, I would not really react to their pro-Putin statements. I would not try to push back and tell them what we were hearing in the West, but rather I was always focusing on the past that we had enjoyed together and that still tied us together, that I still treasured them as human beings. And I wasn't going to let the war, at least at this point, divide us.
Thank you for sharing all that. I think there's a lot for our readers to reflect on, and myself included, as even those here at home who have relationships with people we have loved, with bitter, fierce political differences that have emerged.
Yeah, and you know, my hope is that down the road, who knows? And I may be naive, but my hope is that if I keep the relationship open down the road, when all of this settles, when the war is over, and I really think in the end, Russia's going to be pretty humiliated before it's all over. Then I hope by keeping the relationship open that the time will come when we'll be able to talk honestly again, be able to share the concerns and hurts and confusion that we've had over these months. So that's really my hope that by maintaining the relationship, not to hide anything, but wait for the moment down the road when we can finally get some of this out into the open, but in a context where, again, it can be mutual care, mutual commitment, not trying to just, be angry and hateful toward each other.
Yeah. The final thing I wanted to ask you about, in the article, you kind of describe a certain trajectory of these relationships and conversations sort of changed over time as the war continued on. Well, this article appeared, I think, first on our website all the way back in July. So it's been quite a while since you wrote this piece. I'm curious, how have these conversations continued to evolve since you first wrote this article?
Right. There have been moments where I've reached out again more intensively. For example, when Putin called up a mobilization of 300,000 soldiers, reservists, and I wanted to check in to see if any of my friends, young men, had been affected by this. So, to my surprise and to my gratitude, none of them directly were called up, but most of them did know people who had been called up, and they were anxious about it. It was clear that this was a move that had suddenly made Russians on the ground aware of how serious the situation was. I think up to then, it was sort of something they saw on their television set. It was far away, but now it had really come home. It was beginning to touch people. So I think that over time, the mood has really shifted away from this is going to be quick. We're in the righteous cause. We're going to get this done. Ukraine's going to be liberated. And now it's much more, we're confused. We don't really quite understand why things aren't going well. We keep having confidence that Putin is doing what's right, but this war is going much longer than we expected. And also to add to that, the refugees, there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have fled either willingly or sometimes unwillingly into Russia. But this has also brought the war increasingly home to people, that there are people that need to be cared for. So I would say that I'm seeing, again, this is anecdotal, who knows? There's still a long ways to go. But my sense is that most Russians, even the pro-Putin ones, now see this has not gone well. They've really stepped back from the strong rhetoric. They don't send me all the pro-Putin propaganda that they used to send me 6 months ago. And that tells me that people are becoming more cautious, more concerned, less certain how all of this is going to turn out. Again, and this is why I said earlier, I think this could really end with a real humiliation of Russia and the Russian people. And we need to be thinking ahead towards that as Christians, not only the fact that, of course, we pray for the Ukrainians and their protection, but how will we relate to these people in Russia? That our hope, of course, as Christians, is that down the road we can come to deeper understanding, some measure of reconciliation, even after having to really work through what justice looks like.
Thank you. Thank you for that word. In your article, you mentioned that at one point you had been speaking and called for some amount of empathy for Russian people and citizens, and you got some sort of hate mail or hate call after that. I trust that will not happen from our readers, but I appreciate you calling us to that empathy. So thank you. I'm sure there's a lot more we could say, but we will await your next article in the Christian Century as the situation evolves. Thank you so much for being here. For those of you out there who are interested in John's scholarship on Russia, you can find it in a link below in the video description. He has written a book a few years back called Holy Rus, so you can find out more below. Also, we'll include the link to this article that appeared recently in the Century. Thank you so much for chatting today, John.
Thanks, John. Great to be with you, and all the best to your viewers and readers.
Thank you.